Today I'm going to show you how to install an invisible zipper in what is probably the easiest method that I know of. When I first learned how to install zippers, I probably tried every technique there is in the book. And if you've ever tried to install a zipper yourself, then you know that they can be really frustrating, especially invisible zippers. So after trying pretty much every method there is, finally one of my instructors showed me this method, and this is by far the best one to have almost zero error rate. And this one also requires probably the least amount of prep work. So we're not going to do any of that like ironing it open or anything like that. You just need to have your zipper ready, and then you do need to do a little bit of prep work on the piece that you are going to be installing the zipper to. So for example, I'm going to be sewing the zipper to these two pieces, and you can see that I have my edges finished here. You don't have to have the edge finished, but it does kind of prevent it from stretching a little bit. And I will say that wherever you're installing your zipper, it really helps to have it on the straight grain, not like a curved grain. So zippers at like center back are much better than side zippers for that reason, because you'll have a much easier time doing it when the seam is straight. And especially for practicing, I recommend just practicing with the straight seam. Don't move on to anything curved or slanted or anything, because the seam will get stretched out and it does make it a little bit difficult to sew it in without having the fabric stretch out. So this serging here kind of prevents any further stretching, and also what you could do is sew in some like inseam stabilizer that will also keep the seam from stretching. But other than that, there's no prep work we need to do. We're ready to start sewing this. You will need to have a standard zipper foot. You don't even need to have a invisible zipper foot for this. Just your standard zipper foot is fine. And I'm really only going to use one side. Always have to check to see which side I actually need. So okay, this is the wrong side. So this is a left-sided zipper foot because the needle goes on the left. This is the one that I'm going to use the whole time. I'm not going to switch it at all. So next, we just need to make sure that we have the right length of zipper. So imagine with me, this is the seam that we're going to be sewing the zipper into. Say these are two different sides of a skirt or a top or something, and let's assume that up here is the neckline, and then this is just like the rest of whatever we're sewing. The first thing that we need to do to prep this is we need to determine where our seam is going to stop, and it's not just going to be the full length of the zipper. We're actually going to make the seam stop a little bit above the end of the zipper. So you're going to lay your zipper down on the seam, and then let me just open this so you can see it more clearly where the end is. So that's the end of my zipper there, and I actually am going to begin the closed seam a little bit higher. This is like an inch higher. So that's where the zipper will end, and then the seam will be sewn that way. So with that being said, you have to make sure that you have the right length of zipper. So if you have a zipper gap that should be 9 inches, then you actually need to get a zipper that is a little bit longer than that, maybe like a 12-inch zipper, or just adjust accordingly. You need to have a zipper longer than your zipper opening. So with that done, we're just going to sew from this point down to the rest of our seam, whatever needs to be closed, and then we'll be ready to install the actual zipper. So my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, so you can see here that I stitched 1/2 inch down from here all the way to the end, and this is where my zipper is going to end. So the next thing to do is kind of open this up a little bit. We're not going to press anything yet. So you want to make sure that you place your zipper where it is going to be sewn at the correct seam allowance, but you're just going to align your zipper with the edge here. I mean, I guess this kind of depends on how you're going to finish your edge, but assuming that we're going to do something like this and fold it under like that, or you're going to sew a lining in or something, sewing it to the very top is just fine. You don't have to do anything funny yet. So we just need to make sure that we're placing it at the right seam allowance. So I'm just going to measure into this crevice of the zipper right here. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch, so I'm just going to sew it like that. And for this serge seam, it's really easy because it's just kind of like right up against the edge of my serge seam. But if you're not very confident about sewing this without pins, then you may want to pin it in place a little bit, making sure that it's at the correct spot for the seam allowance. So when we're sewing this, this is the most important part. We are going to stop sewing this exactly where this begins. So my real seam begins here, so when I'm sewing down the zipper, I need to stop sewing right there. Stop sewing my zipper right there. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to replace my zipper foot first. And make sure that you are using the left-handed zipper foot, or the left needle, I should say. And just making sure that when I'm sewing, it does align with my seam allowance here. So here's my 1/2 inch. And when you sew this, you don't have to push the coil out of the way to get into that crevice. You can just sew this right up next to the crevice as close as you can get. And then you can see what that looks like. If you want it to be closer once you're done, then you can do a second row of stitching. But for this instance, I'm just going to sew it straight as close as I can get to the coil. And that just will keep it a little bit easier so it's not shifting or moving too much. So I'm just going to start sewing. So this is the important part when you get down here. I'm going to kind of unroll my coil a little bit so I can see, make sure that this is getting placed correctly. I don't want it to go too far that way. Now we're kind of coming in with our seam allowance a little bit so that we can fit everything in here. So I'm just placing my coil, exactly to the inside of where the very tip of my stitching is. So I'm going to place it right there. So that's where my seam begins, and this is going to be placed right next to it. And then I'm only going to stitch exactly up to this point here. I'm going to stop before I get here, so my stitching is going to end like just a hair above that right there. And be very careful not to go past this point where your seam begins. Maybe you can see that a little bit better there. So my stitching is going to stop right there. And I'm going to back stitch. So when you pull this out of the machine and zip it up, you can see that there are some places where it doesn't fully catch the zipper. So that would be an instance where you need to sew a little bit closer. So like I said, for sewing it down for the first time, it can kind of move the zipper around a little bit if you're trying to push the coil out of the way. So this really helps hold it in place. But if you are a little bit more experienced with these zippers, then you can just sew it in the crevice here as close as you can get to the coil the first time around, and then you won't have to do this second step. So I'm going to do that now and just show you what it looks like, and then when I sew the other side down, I'm just going to sew it as close as possible on the first go so that we don't have to do the second step. So you can see when I push the coil out of the way that it ends up sewing about 1/8 of an inch closer to the zipper. And again, when you do this, make sure that you're stopping at that same spot where we stopped at last time so it doesn't go past where that seam begins. Okay, so now you can see that that zipper is a lot closer. It looks good. And we achieved that without having one of those weird zipper foots or anything like that for the invisible zippers. You can just use a standard regular zipper foot. Okay, so now we're ready to do the second side. And of course, this is going to be the hardest side always. But hopefully with this tutorial, it should be pretty easy. Okay, so for this side, we're going to do kind of the opposite. So with most zipper tutorials, they'll have you change the zipper foot at this point and sew it the same way, but on the other side. But we're not going to do that. That actually kind of messes things up a little bit sometimes. So I know this seems really counterintuitive, but just trust me on this. So we're going to flip this over, and now we're going to sew it from the bottom to the top instead of top to bottom. Really important thing here is just to make sure that your zipper here is lying flat. Let me adjust this a bit. So what do I mean by lying flat? It's not going like that. It's not going like that. I just want this to lie as flat as possible on the seam, not skewed at all, and that is how I'm going to sew my zipper. So I'm just going to put a pin there right now just to kind of hold that in place. And again, this is just the most important part to get this to line up right. Make sure that this part is laying really flat. I know it's hard to tell with this thing in the way, so what you can do is zip it up. Make sure that that looks okay. But you can see that that lays really flat, just kind of like it naturally would if it was sewn there. Okay, so now, being careful not to move that pin, you're gonna wedge this end of the zipper back inside, like that. That part can be a little bit tricky, so that's why I usually don't zip it up to check, but for your first time, you probably want to do that. So you can see here, my zipper stopper is well out of the way of where I'm going to be sewing, and that makes it a lot easier to make this seam really straight because this is going to be out of the way. So I know that seems like it's going to be stuck, but just trust me on this, and we're just going to leave it down there for now. And then we are going to sew exactly from the same point that we stopped at, which is right here, because that's where our seam begins. So we're going to start sewing there, and then we'll sew all the way down to our neckline or wherever the top of our zipper is. So paying attention to our seam allowance again. Remember, this one gets moved kind of slightly in a little bit, just kind of mirror what it is on this side. And then I'm going to uncoil this a little bit. And just make sure my needle is going to go down exactly where my seam begins, exactly where my stitching on the other side of the zipper began, and then we're just going to start sewing this. And now you can see that I am uncurling this as I sew it, so that it'll sew closer to the edge the first time around. And if you did it right, then your zipper should stop at the top in the same place too, of course. So what does that look like from the inside? So you can see this here is where my stitching began for that seam that we created, and this here is where the stitching on the zipper is. So sorry it's not a contrasting thread. I wanted it to be contrasting on here, and I guess I thought there were only two colors in the world. Sorry about that, but hopefully you can see that pretty clearly. So there is just like the slightest gap in between these, but you can see that this stitch stops on the zipper right where a new one would begin for the seam. So it doesn't go past it, it stops right before it. And it kind of looks exactly the same on this side. So now for the moment of truth, we're going to open this up, and then this part can be a little bit tricky, but not too bad. You're just going to take that zipper stopper and wiggle it through, and pull it up. And it does need just a tiny bit of pressing where it got a little bit wrinkled. This is like a rayon fabric, I think. Okay, so here that is after steaming it and ironing it. And as you can see, it's kind of the perfect zipper right on the first try. And this is what it looks like when it is unzipped. So here's another detail that could potentially help you. So you can see that there's really just barely enough space for that coil in there. And that equates to the space that we gave here where we stopped sewing our zipper right here, and where our seam allowance begins. That's just enough space for that coil. I will say that this tutorial is probably not the best for beginners because I am teaching it with the knowledge in mind that you've probably already tried to install an invisible zipper. So I apologize to the beginners who are watching this having never installed an invisible zipper. I'm not sure if this will be as accessible to you, but for all my people who have struggled with installing invisible zippers, I hope that this changes the game for you and makes it a lot easier. And there's Coconut, say hi. Honestly, the first time I learned how to do this, I couldn't believe how easy it was. And I was sort of in shock because all these principles are sort of like the opposite of what they tell you to do when you're installing a zipper. So anyway, I hope that the first time you try this that you are also in shock at how easy it was. And if it didn't work out for you, then try it a few more times. It probably takes a little bit of practice, but hopefully you found this way easier than any of the other methods. Okay, you gotta get out of the way. And if not, if you're still struggling with it, please let me know in the comments what you were struggling with and why you think it didn't work out, or if this method sucks, just let me know. Other than that, I hope that this really changes your zipper game for the better. Until next time, happy sewing!